Hello, Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study series on the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul. Over the last month or so, we've been busily putting together a biographical sketch of this most prolific writer of the New Testament, assembling a timeline of his life and surveying all of the books of the New Testament that are attributed to him. Thank you so much for all the ways that you have engaged with this study, even in this online format. We do miss studying together, but we do know that God can still meet us in the pages of the Bible, even if we're studying here online. And if you're wondering, by the way, why I'm wearing a tie, it's because I'm recording this while I'm on my lunch break as I work from home today. So that's why. Anyhow, it's time to dive back into those pages of the Bible as we take a look at a group of letters of Paul that were all written around the same time and from the same place, but under dramatically different circumstances than those letters that we have studied before. Collectively, these letters are known as the Prison Epistles, and the events that led up to their writing began just a short time after Paul had finished writing his letter to the Romans that we looked at last week. Paul wrote the letter to the Romans while he was in the city of Corinth, and he handed the manuscript off to a trustworthy deaconess of a church in nearby Cenchreae to have it delivered to the Roman capital. Paul's plan was not to travel to Rome himself, but instead to head up to Jerusalem. But even some 25 years after Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road, the sting of his betrayal of the Sanhedrin and the temple when he converted to Christianity had not faded. Paul's presence and his message about the risen Jesus had once again caused chaos in the temple as soon as he got there. And as you may have guessed, yet another riot begins. Paul is arrested. Because of this riot, he is blamed for causing all of this violence, and he's taken before the Roman authorities. He's set to be flogged, but then he appeals to his rights as a citizen of Rome, and thus he is transferred up to Caesarea for his case to be heard by Felix, the proconsul of that Roman province, I should say. So Felix dragged his heels and decided to defer rendering judgment until his term as proconsul ran out. He just slow-walked the thing until he didn't have to worry about it anymore and got reassigned. He was reassigned, and he was replaced by Festus, who heard the case and granted Paul's appeal for the matter to be decided by the emperor himself in Rome. Paul was transferred to the capital city by way of a horrifying shipwreck that we've talked about before, and of course by way of a brief stint on the island of Malta. But eventually he arrives in Rome and was placed under house arrest at his own expense. A Roman guard was posted at Paul's door to keep an eye on him and make sure he didn't skip town. And all while the aging apostle awaited to appear before the emperor and have his case decided. This must have been a time of great uncertainty for Paul. He must have been left to ponder whether there would be more delays to his missionary work. Would he receive a fair trial? Would he ever be permitted to leave Rome and travel west to spread the gospel in Spain? What was God's plan for him? Despite all these pressures and all this uncertainty, Paul continued evangelizing in every way that he could during this period of his life, receiving guests in that home in which he was under house arrest, and writing several letters during his imprisonment. Paul was in captivity in Rome for 2 years, from 60 to 62 AD. It's likely that he produced 3 of these letters in this 4-letter set that we're looking at in very close succession to one another: Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians. Philippians was likely written a little bit later after these first 3, but still within the 60 to 62 range of Paul's time in Rome. The reason why we suspect that Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians are so closely grouped together in time is because Paul mentions several common people in all 3 of these books. For instance, in Colossians, Paul notes that he's in the company of Timothy, Luke, Demas, Aristarchus, Mark, Tychicus, and Onesimus. That's in Colossians 1:1 and in 4:7-14, if you're looking for that. This very same group of individuals are also mentioned in Philemon in verses 1 and 23-24. Now, several of those names should stand out to us as we read them, particularly Luke, who must have just completed his history of Jesus' life and of the early days of the church when he came to Rome to see Paul, since the book of Acts concludes with Paul in prison in Rome, as Luke had just witnessed. But another name on this list also points to an interesting story, Onesimus. The Onesimus of Colossians is almost certainly the same Onesimus who was the subject of Paul's letter to Philemon. Reading Colossians 4, Tychicus was appointed by Paul to carry multiple letters from Rome to various destinations, including one letter that was said to be bound for Laodicea. Now, if you happen to be reading in the ESV translation of the Bible, there's a little bit of a translation problem here in the ESV. It calls this document the letter from Laodicea, but the Greek probably means it's a letter of Laodicea, that is, the letter intended to be delivered to Laodicea, written to the Laodiceans. So that's just a tricky thing about the way the ESV decided to render that. This Laodicean letter is probably what we call Philemon, and it's carried by both Tychicus and by Onesimus, who was returning to his master, who is now living in Colossae, which is very nearby Laodicea. All of this evidence, along with great thematic similarities between Colossians and Ephesians, point to these letters being written very close together, probably during the year 61 AD, and probably beginning with Philemon. It is perhaps a sad accident of history and the canonization process that this letter is named for us after its recipient, Philemon, instead of the man on behalf of whom it was written, Onesimus. Perhaps we would have done better to remember the name of the slave as opposed to the master, but that's perhaps a moot point. Philemon was a wealthy man of Ephesus, and as such, he likely had a number of household servants, including Onesimus. Sometime around 54 or maybe 56 AD, Philemon encountered Paul on the streets of Ephesus, where the apostle was going about his usual evangelistic work. Philemon professed faith in Jesus and became a part of the Christian community, and his commitment was much more than just surface level. To better support Paul's work and the development of the church in Asia Minor, Philemon followed Paul and relocated his household to Colossae. Perhaps it was this major move, with all of its inherent logistical nightmares and scheduling hiccups, that provided the cover that Onesimus needed to put his escape plan into action. It's clear that he was not happy being a slave, which shouldn't surprise us, but the particular details of the suffering that he was experiencing aren't really known. Whatever they were sufficient enough to make Onesimus want to flee from his master's household and to head for the imperial capital of Rome. Perhaps he had family in Rome, or some acquaintances who would help him to piece together a new life. We can reasonably assume that Onesimus had stolen either money or valuable property from Philemon to help him pay his way toward this new life, particularly since Paul mentions in Philemon that any outstanding debt Onesimus owes Philemon should be charged instead to Paul. But when Onesimus arrived in the capital, he was a fugitive from Roman law on the streets of its capital city. And at some point on those streets, he crossed paths with Paul, the house prisoner from Jerusalem, awaiting his appeal before the emperor. Perhaps Paul and Onesimus recognized each other from their time in Ephesus, or maybe the realization of their past meetings and interactions through Philemon came a little bit later in their interactions with one another in Rome. But I imagine that Onesimus, assuming that he didn't become a follower of Jesus right away when Philemon did, he may have blamed Paul for what had befallen him. Perhaps he didn't want to relocate with his master to Colossae so that Philemon could pursue ministry with the church. Perhaps the charity that Paul had preached as a part of the gospel of Jesus had not been shown to him by Philemon's conduct, and in disgust at such hypocrisy, he decided to flee to Rome, only to come face to face with a man who had converted his master to this strange new religion. This is all speculative, of course, and maybe there's a little bit too much drama in this rendering of it, but I do think it's likely that some of this is true when Onesimus and Paul bump into each other in Rome. Now, whatever the case, Paul did not abandon Onesimus or chase him away. Paul clearly ministered to him and led him to faith in Jesus as well. Onesimus became Paul's sidekick in Rome, if you will, helping him accomplish tasks that his house arrest and the scrutiny of the imperial guard likely made impossible for Paul to do, or at least very, very difficult. And he also helped to minister to the Roman churches. But one day, Onesimus came to Paul and asked for his permission to do something Very surprising, and probably absolutely terrifying. He asked to go with Tychicus to Colossae and Laodicea to deliver Paul's letters so that he could come face to face with the master he had betrayed. To help restore this broken relationship, Paul penned the letter that we have in our Bibles as Philemon. It's Paul's shortest letter, but is no less significant than his longer ones. Paul encourages both Onesimus and Philemon to practically demonstrate the theology that he would teach to the Colossians, that in Jesus there is neither slave nor free. Paul offers these two men a completely new way to conceptualize their relationship to one another. Their broken relationship has died, but their new relationship as brothers in Jesus can be raised to life between them. There is a truly powerful story behind this very condensed short letter, and Philemon definitely deserves more attention than it usually gets. Another of Tychicus's deliveries that he's carrying from Paul is to the church in Colossae, and that letter, of course, we call Colossians. This letter provides us a brief glimpse into Paul's frustration over his continued imprisonment in Rome, and his concern that the seemingly endless bureaucratic delays that he has suffered in this capricious imperial legal system are impeding the progress of the gospel around the world. And yet he continues to ask his fellow believers to pray that when he is given an opportunity to speak, he might do so clearly and effectively. 2,000 years later, as we read these letters and consider the life of the Apostle Paul, it might be difficult for us to imagine a scenario in which his work and his dedication to Jesus would come up short, but for Paul himself at this time, writing these letters and staring out an open door and at the back of the Roman soldier guarding it, he must have really carried this weight and this concern and this worry that so much of his effort may be coming to nothing. He's equally concerned for the Colossians because they appear to be falling prey to false teaching within their church that once again involves this thorny matter of how to incorporate Gentile believers alongside Jewish believers in the church. Paul warns the Colossians about a branch of false teaching that's worming its way into their church, a teaching that encourages abstinence from certain activities in order to maintain ritual purity. And this warning is really pretty stark. These ritualistic practices are absolutely worthless pursuits, Paul says, if they are truly devoted to Jesus. Better than abstaining from certain foods is to show true Christ-likeness by abstaining from coveting your brother's possessions, or from desiring that evil befall your sister, or to abstain from slandering your neighbor. This is the kind of abstinence, the kind of purity that God is looking for from his people. If the new covenant in Jesus' blood and body writes the law on our hearts, then it is in the arena of our hearts, in their attitudes and their dispositions, that we must practice an abstinence from things impure. These are not matters of diet and clothing, but they're matters of our thoughts and our intentions. There's actually a lot of similarity between Ephesians and Colossians. In fact, of the 95 verses that make up Paul's letter to Colossae, 60 of those verses have parallels in Ephesians. And so as we turn our attention to Ephesians, we'll actually get a sense of both books as well. Ephesians was the third letter in this group that Tychicus carried out of Rome. The church at Ephesus was the original recipient and the first intended recipient of this letter. But it was apparently Paul's intention that this one become a circular, going from church to church for each community's encouragement and their instruction, as was the case already with some of his other letters. Its message about the relationship between Gentile believers in Jesus and their Jewish counterparts was something all churches needed to hear and to contemplate, as God made these two distinct people groups into one people to call his beloved. Interestingly, unlike in Galatians or in Romans, the words Jew or Jewish do not appear anywhere in Ephesians, and I'm not really sure why. The word Gentile most certainly does appear, and Paul does not shy away from this critical question for the church. How are Gentile believers to participate in the ongoing history of Israel? As we noted in our survey of Romans last week, Jesus can't be ripped out of his Jewish context or understood outside of his lineage and his heritage. theological systems that would decontextualize who Jesus was, or that would claim that his Jewish identity is superfluous to his teaching or his mission, are a great peril to the church. The Gentiles are now participating in Israel. But how? 2 weeks ago, when studying Galatians, I paraphrased a New Testament professor at Fuller Theological Seminary named Tommy Givens, and I'd like to do so again this week. I highly recommend Tommy's book, We the People, Israel, and the Catholicity of Jesus. As a word of caution, the term Catholicity in the title doesn't refer to the Roman Catholic Church, but rather to the more technical sense of Catholic as universal. That is, the universal effect of what Jesus has accomplished for all peoples throughout all succeeding time. Jesus is the pivotal Messiah who makes two distinct groups into one unified group, one Catholic group, if you will. So Tommy says this of Paul's message in Ephesians. Gentiles are now fellow citizens of Israel, fellow participants, members of the household of God, which God is building on the apostles and prophets, with Jesus as the cornerstone. Readers may be claimed by other peoples of the world, but this people of the God of Israel, is your people. The hope of this people, and no other, is your hope. Did Paul ever say that we're the new Israel? No. Neither did he say we are the spiritual Israel. Gentiles have been welcomed into the Israel that already was. And if I may reiterate, this isn't just true for Gentile believers in the first century church. It's true of Gentile believers in every century. It's true for you, and it's true for me. God, in his mercy and his love, through Jesus, his Son, has welcomed us into the Israel that already was. We are not another people of God, or a different people of God, or a separate people of God. We are God's people, and that should give us great encouragement and great confidence. That same love of God sustained Paul throughout his imprisonment in Rome as he awaited to have his case heard by the emperor. Later on, during this 2-year period of house arrest, Paul penned another letter to the church in Philippi, which we call Philippians. There are two primary clues within the text that indicate that Paul is still in Rome when he drafts this letter. First, in chapter 1, verse 13, Paul shares the happy and perhaps improbable news that the faith is beginning to spread within the praetorium, that is, within the elite group of Roman soldiers who guarded the emperor. And Paul's direct knowledge of what was likely something of a secret leads us to believe that he's very close to the situation and still in Rome. More directly, in chapter 4, verse 22, when Paul is engaged in his usual practice of finishing out a letter with the well wishes of those who are surrounding him, he mentions that among those sending their greetings to the Philippians are members and saints of the church within the emperor's own household, that is, the emperor's relatives or his trusted servants living in Rome. So we can say pretty definitively that Paul is still in Rome as he writes, and if still in Rome, still in prison. And yet his tone is actually quite hopeful in this letter, and it appears that he's confident that he will soon hear of a decision on his appeal, bringing his long legal nightmare at last to its end. We can be fairly safe in speculating that he's writing closer to the end of this 2-year period of imprisonment than the beginning. So we can date this letter probably in 62 AD. Paul's relationship with the Philippians has one striking and seemingly unique feature: their overwhelming and overflowing generosity toward Paul. Their financial support of his ministry stretched all the way back to his time in Thessalonica, which must have seemed like a lifetime ago for Paul as he wrote. But even after so long of a time and at such great a distance, the Philippians continue not only to pray for Paul, but to materially support his ministry, sharing a very large gift with him to help defray the costs that he was incurring under Roman guard. Because, again, as you may recall, and as we've said, Roman house arrest comes at the expense of the person who's under arrest. Paul's very grateful and genuinely effusive in communicating this to the Philippians. This is the context in which one of the more famous verses of the New Testament and one of Paul's more famous phrases was written, Philippians 4:13, in which Paul says that he can do all things through him, that is, through Jesus, who strengthens him. This verse has become immensely popular within certain parts of Christian subculture, and is often used as a kind of motto that undergirds personal pursuits or personal achievement. There are athletes who write the numerical reference on their shoes, or perhaps on their whatever you call that material that you place underneath the ice to reduce reflective glare. I'm sure there's a very technical term for that, but I'm not really an athlete, so I'm going to leave it to the athletes and tell me what that means. But consider the verses surrounding this phrase. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you have revived your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned for me, but had no opportunity to show it. Not that I am referring to being in need, for I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. Paul's point here is not that Jesus promises us unlimited resources or preternatural abilities to achieve victory in athletics, or in business, or in academics, or even in mowing the lawn. Instead, Paul is saying that the experiences of his life, the ways in which he suffered, the ways in which he's been blessed, the road God has called him to travel, has shown him firsthand the unwavering faithfulness of God to provide for his needs, no matter what condition he is in, even when that provision seems at times too meager, or perhaps at times embarrassingly extravagant. God's wisdom, so far in excess of our own, knows what we need. The posture of Paul's faith and of his heart is actually reminiscent of how Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Jesus told them to ask for their daily bread, not for tomorrow's bread or for next month's bread, but just enough to live through one more day. This doesn't mean that we can be negligent stewards of our resources and that no long-term planning is ever necessary for us, but it means that God has created each day of our lives as a venue for his blessing and his grace. And we are called to meet each day as God has made it, to rejoice and to trust that God will meet us tomorrow just as he has today. When Paul writes his letter, his days are largely the same, one flowing into the other in an endless wait for the imperial legal system to finally remember him. And yet he still finds joy and comfort in how God provides for him and blesses him, especially through the Philippian church in this case. This is the example to which we are called. Each new day is a chance to experience God's faithfulness and a chance to be used by God to express that faithfulness to others. God strengthens us every day so we may do all the good things within that day that he has prepared for us to do. Thank you again for hanging in there through an unusually long study. We're trying to keep them short as we go. There's just one more week left in our study of Paul's letters, so we're going to finish up our survey of his books that are attributed to him. And next week we're also going to briefly preview our next series of studies that will begin with the season of Lent. So I hope you'll join us then. The Lord bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.